Some of you will know Stephen Leacock's wonderful story, Sunshine Sketches of a Little Town. It's a hilarious and endearing portrait of small-town life in Mariposa. The sketches are a series of profiles of the townsfolk, the merchants, the business people, and the busybodies. Of course, Mariposa and its people are based on Leacock's own experiences of Aurelia. One of my favorite characters, of course, is the Reverend Drone, rector of the Church of England. He's appropriately named because in his sermons he is known to drone on and on and on. For many, many years, the Reverend Drone preached in humility in the little stone church which hearkened back to the pioneer days. He preached in such humility until the narrator tells us in due time the new church was built. And this new church towered over the maple trees of Mariposa and looked down over the town as a beacon set on a hill. The Reverend Drone was fond of calling the new church a beacon on a hill, as he was fond of calling it a lighthouse and a harbor and an anchorage. He was also fond of calling it a tabernacle and a covenant, and also a pledge and an earnest, a very first fruit of endeavor. He was also fond of calling this new church a greater testimony and a newer evidence. It was the very city set on a hill. Not that he was prone to cliche, of course. We're not so unlike the Reverend Mr. Drone. We admire a building that is grand in scale and has been beautifully constructed. Some of us have traveled around the world, gone to great length and expense to see some of our planet's great buildings. Buildings like the pyramids of Egypt, or the Parthenon in Athens, perhaps the Colosseum in Rome, or the Taj Mahal in India. Certainly you would not go to New York City without trying to catch at least a glimpse of the Empire State Building. Millions have come from around the world to our own backyard to see the CN Tower. Now, I think it's fair to say that the great church buildings of Christendom can keep good company with humankind's greatest feats of architecture and construction. Great church buildings such as Westminster Abbey or St. Paul's Cathedral. Great church buildings such as Notre Dame or the Crystal Cathedral, or perhaps the grandest of them all, St. Peter's Basilica. We're so fortunate here at Collier Street, aren't we, to have a building which is both grand and beautiful. The Jews of Jesus' day were just like we are. They liked to see an impressive building, and they were most proud of their treasured worship space, the temple in Jerusalem. A temple had been part of their people's heritage for centuries. The first temple was built centuries before the time of Jesus Christ by King Solomon. In the 6th century BC, that first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. And then a few decades later, a second temple was rebuilt. In the time of Jesus, this second temple was undergoing extensive renovations under the direction of King Herod the Great. This temple was said to be the most impressive and beautiful building that one could see in hundreds of miles in several directions. It was both grand and beautiful. Some of the stones that made up the temple are reportedly as much as 40 feet long and 12 feet high, weighing hundreds of tons each. Large portions of the outside of the temple were covered in gold, so they absolutely glistened in the sunlight. This temple was a center of national, religious, and cultural life for the Jews. It was a source of great pride. It was a symbol of God's covenant relationship with them. Its presence was a very mark of divine providence. A few minutes ago, we heard a short story from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 13. At this point in the Gospel narrative, Jesus has decided to bring his life and his activities, his public ministry, to some kind of climax and conclusion. So he's come with his disciples to the capital city, Jerusalem. And here in chapter 13 of Mark's Gospel, Jesus has come to Jerusalem, and he is in the very last week of his life. Now, during that final week of his life, he went often with his disciples to the temple to teach and to preach about God's kingdom. In this particular episode, he and the disciples have been inside the temple, and now they have come back out. And it's late in the afternoon, and the sun is beginning to go down, and you can picture them standing on the front steps, the grand entranceway to the temple, and the disciples, who are rural fellas, standing there with their necks craned upwards, saying, "Teacher, check this place out. These stones are humongous. What an incredible building our people have here." But Jesus seems to retort almost offhandedly that the whole thing is going to be knocked down. Now, Mark doesn't tell us exactly, but we can imagine the disciples were especially shocked that Jesus would say this, because the conversation is immediately dropped. It's only later on, when they've made their way as a group out of the city and across the valley to the Mount of Olives, where they were at perhaps the best place to view the temple's grandeur, that four of the disciples, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, who were sort of an inner circle within the inner circle, went to Jesus privately. And they said, like, "Jesus, what were you talking about earlier when you said the temple was going to be destroyed? Like, how is this going to happen, and when is it going to take place?" And Jesus gives an answer which to us can only bring confusion. He starts talking to them about wars and earthquakes and famines and birth pangs. What's going on here? Well, first of all, in a literal sense, Jesus was saying that the temple is going to be destroyed. Second of all, in a more figurative way, he was trying to say to those disciples what it would be like for those who were around when that happened, and what its significance would be. He said the temple is going to be destroyed, and then with his imagery of earthquakes and famines, he was saying it's going to seem like a terrible disaster. Jesus here is using a form of expression known as apocalyptic. It was a common way to communicate in the Jewish culture of his day. Apocalyptic involved using really oversized metaphors to try and capture the spiritual and theological significance of an event for which everyday language didn't seem to be sufficient. One scholar who has helped me and countless others have a little bit more appreciation of this apocalyptic kind of expression says that the key to this particular passage is in Jesus' use of the metaphor of childbirth and delivery. Now, as we all know, childbirth and labor is an incredibly painful experience. In fact, it's so painful that it's only tolerable because the woman giving birth knows that it is a temporary pain and also that it is necessary for the new life to come. Here Jesus is saying that the destruction of the temple and all of the terrible upheaval and cultural unrest that accompanies it will be almost incomprehensibly painful, but that this pain will be temporary and that it is necessary for something new to come. So Jesus is saying that the temple is going to be destroyed. It's going to be a terrible experience for those who witness it, but that it is necessary for something new to come. What is this new thing that Jesus is saying will replace the temple? Well, in a word, himself. You see, a major theme of Jesus' life and work, and therefore a major theme of the entire gospel narrative, is that Jesus is calling people away from their devotion to such things as the temple and the law of Moses, and instead is inviting them into relationship with himself. He is asking people to turn away from these lifeless objects and institutions, which, though they have the potential for good, are so easily corrupted by the selfishness and greed and pride of humankind, and to come in to a relationship with him whereby they would know and experience firsthand the love and the care of God for them in an intimately personal way. I once read somewhere, someone was talking about Canada's monarchy, which is, of course, the monarchy also of Britain and several other countries, that its main benefit and appeal is that it focuses the consciousness of a nation not around some lifeless object like a flag. Rather, it brings people into some kind of relationship with a person, a relationship whereby there is some kind of mutual care, concern, respect, love, and so on. Well, think what you will about the monarchy. But this kind of thing is unquestionably what is going on with much of Jesus' activities, his teachings, his healings, his prophetic actions, and so on and so forth. Jesus is inviting people away from this kind of outward religious devotion centered around objects and inviting them into relationship with himself, whereby his first hearers and we ourselves can know and experience in an intimate and personal way the very love of God. Today, as we have already learned, is the 176th anniversary of Collier Street Church. That is just amazing to me. This congregation was formed all the way back in 1836. This beautiful sanctuary in which we are gathered came a little bit later. It was built in 1864. Now, have you ever wondered, as I have, why our ancestors of faith in this community built such a grand and beautiful building as they did? Have you ever wondered why this building and thousands of others like it around the world are instantly recognizable as a church? You know, the Bible doesn't tell us what a church building ought to look like. In fact, the New Testament doesn't even know the first thing about a building dedicated specifically for the church. And in fact, we could go elsewhere in this city and go all around the world and find Christians gathered in spaces that look absolutely nothing like this. But yet we know this is a church. You ever wondered why? Well, a brilliant answer has been provided by someone called Bill Westfall of York University. He wrote a wonderful book about Protestant Christians in Ontario in the 1800s. And he said in that book that in the second half of the 1800s, at the time when this very building was built, Protestant Christians in Ontario thought that society was going to hell in a handbasket. People were playing cards on Sunday afternoon. Some people were even drinking alcohol. It may be that the women were wearing short skirts that revealed too much of their ankles. Who knows? They decided to bring an end to this moral decay by building churches in the Gothic style of the Middle Ages in order to hearken people back to a supposedly more Christian time. In other words, buildings such as ours were constructed to be the very message of the church. Unfortunately, buildings don't make good sermons. Buildings can symbolize lots of things if the people who see them are attuned to the symbolism. But buildings don't help us know and experience the love of God. Buildings in and of themselves don't invite us into relationship with Jesus. One of my old theology teachers once remarked that the great cathedrals of Europe had in many cases become little more than museums of religion. And that's true. If you've ever visited one, you're not so likely to find a living and vibrant community of faith. No, you'll be invited to buy your ticket for $10 or $20 so that you can go in and look around and take pictures. If stones brought us into relationship with Jesus, then those cathedrals in Europe would be homes to vibrant and living communities of faith. If that were true, then there would not be so many beautiful buildings like this one in our country that have been redeveloped into condominiums. How can we prevent this church from becoming a museum of religion? A good answer comes to us in another one of the New Testament books, the first letter of Peter, in which the author tells us that we are to be ourselves as living stones, which, when set upon the foundation of Jesus, become a living and holy temple that God might be in our midst as a community. God does not wish to reside within these four walls or within any four walls. God does wish to live in the midst of a people who are a community that loves God and loves others. And it is when God is in our midst that, when in a figurative sense we ourselves make up this holy temple, that we are doing God's work and achieving God's purposes. So that we come together to be reminded of God's presence and love and power, and then are scattered to go out and carry the good news of God's love in the person of Jesus, both with our words and with our actions. One insightful critic once wrote that Stephen Leacock's Mariposa could not be anything other than an Ontario town. That is so true, especially of its Church of England congregation, which built a brand new church, a grand and beautiful structure, so that it would be a greater testimony and a newer evidence. Unfortunately for them, the building was too grand and too beautiful. They couldn't afford to pay for it, and it nearly ruined them. Then one night, the Reverend Drone was sitting in his study in the rectory, and he looked out and saw a strange and peculiar light in the night sky. He wondered to himself, is this now the dawn of the New Jerusalem brightening in the east? No, it was the new church building engulfed in flames. It seems that Mr. Mullins, the manager of the local bank, had decided the congregation would be better off trading its mortgage payments for an insurance settlement. The narrator tells us at that point that the new church building became a very beacon kindled upon a hill. Our church can be a beacon on a hill in 2012 and for another 176 years if we are as living stones built upon the foundation of Jesus, that God will dwell in our midst, that we as a community will be God's holy temple in this place, loving God and loving others, doing God's work, reaching out to those around us in our community, especially those in greatest need, with God's mercy and compassion. When we do things like this and continue to build on the wonderful things being done at present, in truth, we are a beacon on a hill, and we will be a beacon on a hill that cannot be hidden. Amen.